Oh yeah, true. POI is in the chat, or you can put your hand up as well. I can see you all, I believe. Okay, I'll start now. The burden on the Gov bench in this debate is incredibly high because they must prove that a treaty which demonstrably effectively prevented the deployment of nukes since the Cold War has caused reserves to dwindle is regrettable, that it did not do enough to ensure the reality that it empirically has. I do not think they meet that burden. Three things in this speech, responses throughout. The first is as to why this treaty would not work and you would not get the signatories that you would require to meet all of the benefits that they have of a non-nuclear world. Secondly, as to why even if Russia was able to sign onto this, was able to agree to this disarmament, other states would not, again, effectively axing their access to benefits. And the last as to why it is actively good that this policy was not in place, assuming that, for example, the US and Russia both were signatories. Let's talk about why it wouldn't work, specifically in the context of the end of the Cold War. And I would note that this is an incredibly tense context. This was, a context where you had populations of people who were so ideologically opposed to each other, governments who had so little faith in the other that, to uphold ends of bargains, for example, because they had just been at Cold War for 50 years. The framing I'll put here is that the agreement that was eventually signed onto was agreed to because it was to incapacitate each other slowly without doing so entirely from the outset. And I would note that something which is total disarmament, which is pushed quite aggressively, is framed as an all or nothing solution to the process of to the capacity for states to have nuclear weapons. And I think it is one that is inherently viewed with distrust for a few reasons. The first is the total, political unpopularity of pushing a process like this, which says we will get rid of all of our nuclear weapons in the hopes that these people who we have been opposed to, that you have been taught to hate when you are in school, that you have been taught will bomb you at any point in time, are people that we can now trust to also disarm themselves. But secondly, I think the government also believes that they have governments of these respective states also do not believe that these governments will hold their words. I think the problem with this solution, this total disarmament solution that OG and the Gov bench are bound to push, is that firstly, even if you do not push it aggressively, it is framed as something which is all or nothing. It is incredibly hostile. It is saying that until we can trust that you have nothing in your reserves at all, we simply will not trust you. The second thing to say, though, is that they are bound to push aggressively. And I think, sure, this can look like potentially threatening to withhold aid, for example, but it also probably involves military threats, given the context of a war that is in place, which is to say, if you do not, disarm yourselves nuclearly, we are going to take drastic action. At the very least, if they do not explicitly threaten military action, is very likely to be construed through Russian propaganda as such. I think the result of this is that at the end of the Cold War, Russia simply does not sign on to nuclear disarmament treaties for a few reasons. Firstly, Russia has zero faith that the US is likely to do this reciprocally because they have spent decades distrusting them. Secondly, as a matter of face, I think it is incredibly embarrassing to be like, oh yeah, never mind, you guys are right, we'll give up all of our weapons. That is something that Russia, which is built on a propagandistic machine, the support of its citizens who think it is strong, are unlikely to do. Thirdly, I'll take POIs in a bit. Thirdly, I think this would just be massively politically unpopular, even if it was not in the interest of the government to look strong to the rest of the world. They want their population to think they're strong. And the fourth thing to say is that they probably are just faced with a legitimate threat, whether that threat is military, whether that threat is total economic, being cut off from the rest of the world. I think OG say that they have an active incentive to want to get rid of their nukes because they don't want to hold the power of the sun in their hands. I think the power of the sun can be pretty fucking compelling if you think your opposition has the power of the sun hidden in their back pocket. And even if they don't, I think a lot of power, a lot of leaders just do enjoy having a lot of power. That was really unclear. I think not only is it unlikely Russia is going to sign on to this treaty, I think they probably arm themselves more, and the US is also forced to arm themselves more because of how hostile, because of how unamendable this seems. The impact of this, the Cold War probably continues, even if it stopped for a bit. The threat of mutually assured destruction still looms large. But I think that threat of nuclear destruction just does increase. Any marginal increase, any chance of a nuclear attack above one, or any one nuclear attack which did not happen in the status quo does exist in their world, that is damaging. Let's talk about other states as well, because assuming that Russia signs on, it is so unclear that other states would also. Look, most of the other conflicts in the world in which parties do have nuclear weapons are totally outside of the realm of the US and the Cold War. Israel has weapons because it has been in a conflict since the 1940s. It is, the second intifada happened in the early 2000s, and it's so unclear why the US offering them support would cause them to denuclearize when they're still in this active conflict. North Korea has nuclearized because it is a rogue nation, because it is something that is not because they are afraid of the US attacking them, but because it is a power that they want. The incentives to have nuclear weapons that exist in this debate largely exist outside of the context of the Cold War, which is why I think the incentives to like, oh, maybe the US will be a bit nicer to you, largely do not apply. Because if you are afraid that your neighbor, who is not the US, if you're India, for example, and you're worried about China invading you, you probably don't care if the US is going to be nicer to you, because the alternative that you might face is just total annihilation, and that is bad, which means other countries likely do not become signatories. Not only, and the ones that do become signatories for the benefits that they point to, are much more incentivized to hide their nuclearization because of how high the bar is, because they are trending towards zero. They're likely to keep a few secret weapons somewhere. I think this is harmful for a few reasons. Firstly, you decrease the taboo that currently exists in relation to nuclear weaponry. You don't have an actor like the US who has nukes and says, I will not use this unless it is a last resort. You have the only states that have them are states that are happy to use them. And secondly, you do not get mutually assured destruction. You do not get the threat that if you nuke another state, a country like the US will intervene and nuke you in response. Obviously, this means you're much more trigger happy in this respect. This is massively important. These are live conflicts that we are talking about that could have escalated more in the 30 or so years since the Cold War, and they did not because of this threat of intervention from some capacity. I will take CG.
Boris Yeltsin is Russia's first president. He's a man who loves life and a good drink. Who was his biggest backer?
I'm going to be honest, I don't know that. I don't think that like goes against any of the claims that I just made, though. I don't know if the OIV knows that either, just putting that out there. Although, okay, let's talk about why the status quo is good, which is to say we think it is incredibly likely that this treaty would fail. But even if it did not, why is it good that the US and Russia still have nukes? The first thing to note is just empirically, there has not been a nuclear attack since the Cold War, since the 1940s. I think and additionally, the stockpiles that nations do have declined because of this gradual agreement, because nations are allowed to keep some nukes in the case of an attack. I think that continuing existence of mutually assured destruction is important because nations like feeling that they don't want to use their nukes, but they can if that threat still exists, because nukes are not something that you must, be in the global scrutiny of if you are in possession of. The idea that there could be nukes anywhere in the world means countries feel safer when they have some on their own. Obviously, that is important. And the last thing I'll observe here is that doing so, the US aggressively pushing this policy would be a massive burn of political capital, because you are telling your citizens that this country they've been afraid of for so long, now you are going to get rid of all the weapons that protected you from them. There are many other things the US has done since the end of the Cold War. They intervened in Somalia in the 1990s. They intervened in the Bosnian War. The humanitarian benefits you get there could not exist in a world where the US burnt all their capital, trying to create a treaty which simply would not go through.
Okay, I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for those fine remarks. Now welcome up the Deputy Prime Minister. Here. I'd like those fine remarks and welcome up the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Okay, hello, am I audible? What I want to do before this opening half concludes is just frame the enormous successes of the status quo that this opening government team cannot run away from. First, no nuclear weapons have been deployed in a major military conflict since the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in the 1940s, and the horrors of that deployment echo through to the modern day. The opposition they describe is a status quo opposition, and it is overwhelming. Secondly, there has been an enormous decline, something like a quartering of global nuclear weapons reserves since the peak of the Cold War. Thirdly, estimations that there would be 20 or 30 nuclear nations by 2020 were enormously overstated because the community globally in the status quo has shunned and employed economic mechanisms to make it incredibly undesirable and difficult to own a nuclear weapon for reasons that opening government themselves describe. This government bench is proposing an enormous gambit, shunning a policy that has been, seen holistically, a miraculous success of generational good that has saved potentially millions of lives. What I'll do in this speech is first explain why you certainly don't persuade Russia and reignite the Cold War. And if you do persuade Russia, you absolutely do not persuade other states that would have the incentive to nuclearize, because the invention of the nuclear weapon in Los Alamos in 1940s opened a Pandora's box of a weapon that is like the power of the sun, that states that are rogue, that do fear their enemies on their borders, will ultimately, at some point in time, want to deploy. That Pandora's box will never be closed. That is regrettable, but it will never be closed. At some point during history, if the world does succeed at achieving opening government's case, at fully denuclearizing, there could be a potential state that does decide, for the reasons that this enormously powerful weapon does exist, to continue to hold nuclear weapons, and they could deploy it. And the status quo is one in which we are gradually denuclearizing, but the United States and Russia, being enormous countries of superpower quality, do hold a deterrent stock of nuclear weapons that keep the threat of mutually assured destruction very live. What the government bench in this debate defends is not keeping that threat alive, and the weighing of that clinches this debate for opening opposition, because the status quo has worked well at denuclearizing, but also preserving the threat of mutually assured destruction for a weapon that ultimately could be employed. If one rogue state ultimately attains nukes at some point in history, at a point where we've denuclearized, that would be enormously regrettable. Why would this not have succeeded in the case of Russia? The observation I'll make about opening government is their case is essentially, we'll do the status quo, but a little bit harder. They're unspecific, I think, about the mechanisms that distinguish what they are defending from the status quo. For instance, they defend economic measures, they defend global cooperation, they defend going really hard, which I would suggest are all features of the status quo. They suggest that, we would do it in a stepwise fashion, just like the status quo. The US has lots of things to offer, like they have in the status quo, offered to countries in order to not become nuclear powers. In order to defend some delta in this debate from the status quo, opening government would actually have to defend something like that is a stick, like a military threat, or even if not that, much bigger economic threats. And at a point in time in which there is still enormous cultural, ideological, and to be honest, military distrust between Russia and the United States, it seems unlikely that this maneuver would succeed. The reason the status quo has worked is because it is necessarily stepwise and slow, because you don't want to affect your bottom line, and you don't have to with the agreements that exist like START. But you can see if it works, if the other state is acting in good faith, and see if they're reducing their stockpiles. And if they do, you can know that you're working well, which means that creates a feedback cycle that has led to the nuclear disarmament. If at any point in time you distrust the other, that is the mechanism, the incentive that leads to rearmament. And that's bad. They suggest that there's this broad humanitarian end goal because it's expensive and dangerous and people hate the power of nuclear weapons. Sure. But there are also other reasons that states want nuclear weapons, even if they are costly, even if people are scared of them, because the power of being Israel and having every state in your region not have normalized relations with you and have military threats against you ultimately is a motivation to develop it against the wishes of the international community. And that would exist in either world, and I suggest it probably would exist in the case of Russia. The consequences of failing to persuade Russia are enormous. Copy and paste the weighing that Sophie gives for nuclear war and activate it here. If there was a context of rearmament of nuclear weapons that resulted from a failed United States policy that would achieve all the same outcomes that they achieved, but it would also lead to a deterioration in relations between states that empirically did improve in the 90s and 2000s, and that is regrettable. Let's talk about other nuclear states. They suggest that you'd reduce the market for it such that it would be unviable. This is the status quo. It is incredibly difficult to produce nuclear weapons. However, states like Iran, states like Israel, states like North Korea, who are incredibly isolated on the grounds of access to nuclear energy, who do have allies that wish them to not develop nuclear weapons, still have done so. They've built their comparative of a vision of the world in which we're fast and loose with nuclear weapons, which we're just not. The truth is that while nuclear weapons are known to exist, which they do in either world, states have an incentive in some cases to develop them. We contend that ultimately the knowledge that you can have a nuclear weapon, and this is an ultimate weapon that can be deployed and can protect you from harm, is one that will entice states for the rest of human history. This would not succeed, and it certainly won't succeed in the full scope of human history, the consequences of which are enormous, and I'll impact in a moment, but I'll take closing government.
North Korea got nukes in 2006, and Iran is going to get it in a few weeks, months, or whatever in the future. Doesn't this mean your policy has already failed?
I would suggest that the fact that they you just described a country that's had it for 15 years or 20 years and hasn't deployed it. That suggests an enormous success of the international deterrent systems. The point of this argument is to suggest that if you guys are right, that this does lead to global superpowers who have the greatest stockpiles of nuclear weapons disarming to the point of zero or near zero, that it doesn't matter because at some point in history, there is like uranium in the world. There is the knowledge that nuclear weapons can be created and they have enormous power. And that if that happens at a point in history where that is the only state or one of the only states in the region that does have nuclear weapons, that will mean that that weapon is likely to be deployed in conflict, which is the actual harm of nuclear weapons rather than them simply existing. If it is the case that in the 2010s, North Korea developed nuclear weapons at a point where we were all disarmed, or Iran developed it at a point where we were all disarmed, that would be disastrous for the Middle East. That is not the case in the status quo, for the reason that there is still the threat of superpower mutual assured destruction, which would not exist in your world. That is the weighing you must keep in your mind when you evaluate our contribution and our comparison with every other team in this debate. The status quo has worked. It has contained the Pandora box of the creation of the nuclear weapon in Los Alamos, the best possible way that can have be achieved given the context of the 1990s. It is an enormous success. You shouldn't shun it.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for those fine remarks and thank all the teams in the opening half of the debate. I'd now like to welcome up the member for the government. Yeah.
All right, just want to check there's no feedback at the moment. This all working. Right. Yeah, okay. Kind of working.
Now there's feedback.
Because Aaron unmuted.
Everyone good? Opening government says the United States has a few carrots and many more sticks. Opening opposition says that's not nearly enough. Our extension will decisively resolve this question, and it will do so by asking the questions missed by the top half of this debate. Firstly, why is it that countries have nuclear weapons in the status quo? The answer is because they perceive it to be the best tool to keep them safe from the threat of aggression. It's the one thing that guarantees you will not be invaded. Secondly, why didn't denuclearization occur in the counterfactual? The answer to that is twofold. Firstly, because the US did not push for it, nor did any other actor. That obviously changes on our side when the US would do so. But secondly, because countries still felt that the threat of aggression was real, even during the US's unipolar moment, and that is why any attempt to disarm must deal with that threat of aggression. Our extension will explain why the only viable mechanism for disarmament is to address these security threats, and will win us the debate for a very simple reason, that not only will it prove all of opening government's impacts, it will prove the far more important impact, which is why we're actually able to deter and prevent conventional war, which is something that actually has killed millions of people and will continue to kill millions of people. It is the most certain impact in this debate. It is the most important impact in this debate. It is why closing government must win. Firstly, how is it that the US would be able to assuage states that they would not need to fear the threat of aggression anymore? 5 reasons. The first is we're very likely to see international agreements and treaties such as the Rome Statute moved forward substantially in time and signed much earlier. Things that criminalize aggression, things that allow for the prosecution of those people, generals, politicians, and leaders who allow that aggression to occur, and the enforcement mechanisms to ensure that those people suffer when they do so and deter that conduct in the first place. Secondly, the US would withdraw troops from forward positions, from overseas military bases, from places where they are no longer needed in the absence of the Cold War. They would not continue their unipolar moment as a moment of aggression. They would continue it as a moment of peace. And this would obviously be viable, 1, because the topic implies it, but 2, obviously because it would be incredibly popular to do so. It would save huge amounts of money for the American citizen. It would make them richer. It would make their lives better. People were tired of war. They were desperate for peace, and we would give it to them. Thirdly, it would look like far greater security guarantees. Things like the expansion of NATO, things like pushing for similar regional alliances for countries that were scared of NATO to form on their own with similar Article 5 provisions that would allow them to feel safe, to feel like the threat of conventional war was very unlikely to strike them because they had sufficient conventional power to push back against those things that would reassure those countries. Fourthly, the advancement of international law principles like responsibility to protect that would convince weak states that stronger countries would come to their defense and that there was international commitment and consensus behind the idea that aggression was wrong and must be prevented wherever it occurs. The weak should not be made victims of the strong. Finally, it would look like the stronger international institutions, things like the UN developing principles to allow for sanctions, to allow for interventions, to allow for recriminations against states that engaged in hostile behavior, things like seizing their assets when they were overseas, things like cutting off trade, things like punishing individual leaders and ensuring that states never again felt that they had it within their ability to engage in the kinds of conflicts that ruined lives. Why was this by far the most important impact in the debate? Firstly, because it actually makes the case for why states would feel secure. When states feel secure, that is precisely when they would be willing to engage in nuclear disarmament, but that is also precisely when they'd be willing to forego conventional war, because the costs of doing so are raised precipitously at this point in time, and the benefits of conventional war, we note, have been declining over time, because more and more, war is not about land, it is not about resources, it's about people, it's about intellectual capital, it's about infrastructure, the very things destroyed by war, the very things that mean that war is not as profitable as it used to be. When the costs go up massively, that means that war does not occur in the way that it otherwise would. That looks like it's far less likely the invasion of Iraq occurs. It's far less likely the invasion of Ukraine occurs. It's far less likely the first Gulf War occurs. And we know that this is clearly the biggest and most important benefit in the debate. But thirdly, I want to point out the counterfactual isn't just one where some nuclear powers continue to have nuclear weapons. It is one of increasing proliferation. And this escalates the harms that opening government talks about precipitously, because it explains why it's not just the risk that exists now of nuclear annihilation, it's an increasing risk of nuclear annihilation as more and more countries get nuclear weapons. Why is that very likely? Look at, as we POI, Iran, look at North Korea, look at other states that have expressed interest. Japan, that keeps technology to do so under lock and key. South Korea, where Yoon Suk-yeol literally said South Korea needs nukes. It is the only way to be safe from China. And obviously, when it is the case that you feel the only way you can be safe is to engage in mutually assured destruction, as opening opposition propositions, that is exactly when you are likely to want nukes and you're likely to get nukes. The risks of escalation are far, far higher on-side opposition. If that was the harm they wanted to bite, that is exactly why they lose. Before I go on, opening opposition, what do you have?
Your extension assumes that the US and the rest of the world have no appetite for self-defense, but how does the US changing in the way that you describe make India see Pakistan as less of a threat, for example?
Well, firstly, I would say it seems very likely that countries have an interest in self-defense, but not in offense, because obviously they want to maintain what they have. We explain the cost of taking what others have goes up. The reason it would make, for example, India and Pakistan feel far safer is, one, if those countries were to denuclearize, the biggest threat that they pose to each other is taken off the table. But secondly, when we suggest that the cost of engaging in marginal changes in the border on, for example, the borders between India and Pakistan in Kashmir, or between India and China in, the Golan Heights, sorry, not the Golan Heights, but marginal changes in borders in places like Ladakh, for example, mean that you just don't care as much. What does it matter if a line in the sand moves 4 meters this way or 4 meters that way, when no one actually lives, when the cost of doing so is international sanctions, when the cost of doing so is your country being ruined? We changed the decision-making calculus for the people who mattered most when it meant those people going to jail for the rest of their lives, those people being international pariahs, those people being remembered as warmongers and war criminals and never having the legacy that they wanted to do. That is why we changed things. Finally, weigh this against everyone else in the debate. OO says losing MAD is bad. Firstly, you don't need mutually assured destruction if there are no nukes. Secondly, MAD doesn't deter conventional war, and that is the problem. Conventional war is what continues to kill. We are the only side that addresses the biggest threat in the debate. Secondly, they say rogue states are an issue. No, we put together the crippling international pressure necessary to bring those states to heel, but also rogue states don't go rogue on their own. They need the support of superpowers. North Korea got weapons because Russia and China helped it. Iran received help from other countries. When those countries don't have nukes, when those countries don't want other people to have nukes, when they don't provide isotopes and expertise, rogue states cannot get nukes. Finally, why does this win up over opening government? Firstly, because their mechanization as to why this might happen provides a set of tools the US could use, but it doesn't explain why things did not happen at the moment. It does not address the actual concern that prevents world peace. We do. Secondly, we provide the only credible path for ending conventional war, a far larger impact than that of opening government, for the reason that it's something that actually kills millions of people every single year. The risks they talk about are hypothetical. Thirdly, we explain why their risks become far larger over time. All of this means closing government very, very clearly wins the debate. So proud to support.
Okay, I'd like to thank the member for the government for those fine remarks and welcome up the member for the opposition. Here.
Okay. Cool. I'll do POIs visually. Yeah. Anyways, thanks everyone for being in this round.
Oh, your girlfriend.
Oh yeah, I have to say something, which is 41 minutes ago. It was my girlfriend's 21st birthday. Instead of being there, I am currently speaking to a computer. It would really be nice to me if like that could be rewarded in some way, say victory, so that I don't look like an awful boyfriend. That would just make me look really good. Like I'd super appreciate it if you have in your heart. Anyways, you know, do with that what you will. Okay, on to the extension, the second most important part of my speech. The truth in this round is that we don't know if negotiations will work. CG, OG, and OO never prove it to you either way. We do know, however, that the world of 2023 is undoubtedly indebted to the NPT because the Cold War did end and the suffering that it inflicted did end. Wars have gotten infinitely less lethal, and this is a valuable change in our world that we are happy to stand by. I want to do one thing in this speech, really, after I refute CG, like very, very quickly, which is to explain why it's the case that the type of negotiation that you got in the world of government, irrespective of if it works, took an incredibly and inordinate amount of time, and the delay that it took to get negotiation and to get disarmament, even if you did got it, carries with it incredible harms for people that we can with certainty predict, and these are the most important things in the round. Responding to CG proves that disarmament is idealistically good. That is fine. They still depend on proving that you can get to a negotiating table and that those negotiations work. So they are already like dependent on OG's case in order to do anything in this round. I don't know though why it's the case that that wars don't happen in their world. Like countries fight for other things irrespective of the existence of nukes. It's things like land and resources. And historically, the primary cause of war has not been war between nuclear powers. It has been cases of asymmetric warfare. You have not seen the US and Russia go to war for very good reason, but you do see countries in asymmetric circumstances doing this. I want to move into the extension then, because I just don't think that the CG case is doing all that much that is new for the round. So our extension is that this happens very, very slowly. So it is very, very debate from OG to try and say, well, probability exists, so this is all that matters. No, we should care about certainty. And we know with certainty that nuclear arms have not been used, however scary this are. So what matters in this debate is compromise and how you actually get it. I want to prove for the first time in this debate why we think it's the case that nuclear arms just do not get used, as we have empirically seen to be the case. First of all, they carry with them visceral images of harm. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is something that everyone understands to be terrifying and awful, so the concept of reusing and using nuclear arms again is something that scares people in ways that are visceral. It is shocking imagery that people cannot get behind. But second of all, governments are risk averse. The notion of engaging in nuclear warfare that could possibly devastate entire civilian populations, because all you have to do as soon as you detect a nuke in the air is send one right back, is awful. People don't want that in their legacy. But third of all, infrastructure for safety things that OG criticizes has just gotten better over time. We have better nuclear scientists. We have better industries devoted to protecting people because we are more aware of the risks of nuclear arms and of the risk of nuclear technology in general. People care about nukes for the reason that CG highlights, which is they're just a signal. Respect us. Talk to us. Don't abuse us. Even if more countries has them, as CG threatens, they do not get used. So at the end of it, the amount of actual conflict that you are getting from these is very, very irrelevant. So The point I want to make here is that these negotiations, moving into the extension that happen slowly, they just take a very long time. Obama tried to achieve total nuclear disarmament. It failed in spite of the reasons that OG highlights. And the reason is you have to convince lots of countries. You have to engage in sanctioning per OG, crippling an entire economy to pressure decision-making, which as we have seen empirically, is very, very difficult to do. Sanctions are not a very good foreign policy tool historically, but you also have to convince countries with histories of nationalism and conflict that they can trust each other, that they can cast away their defenses and move on. Confidence is low that you can actually enforce these types of decisions because tech is very early stage. You don't have a developed UN that is monitoring nuclear arms, so you don't have a lot of this. What does this mean? It's not that you do or don't get disarmament, but that it takes decades, that there are multiple administrations that need to have the same alignment in order to continue these talks, that countries agree, then they pull out when things change, and then they go back into it, that there is a massive prisoner dilemma with tens and tens of countries, which means that it's very, very hard to get change. And counterfactual, the NPT was way easier. You still have leverage, even though you are using fewer arms. You don't look weak to your people who want proof that you can defend them in the case of disaster. And 3, it's just a much smaller ask. What are the effects of slowness? So what I want to suggest is that as the decades pass, that we are trying to achieve total disarmament. Even if we get it, it is an irrelevant goal because there's the same amount of conflict, period. But in that time, people do suffer. Why? There are tens of millions in Russia, for example, that starve and suffer on an ongoing basis. Why? This is a huge political expense. This is the most important existential issue to people toward the immediate end of the Cold War because of how permanent it is in their mind. But you are not focusing then on rebuilding supply chains and restoring wealth for the impoverished people living in gulags. Instead, your government is demanded among the elites to make sure that you address the issue of disarmament so all of your political resources and capital move into this. But second of all, you empower radicals within Russia. You tell people that are on the side of nuclear armament that there is a weakness in the government and they cannot collectivize and they cannot get negotiation. And so in that transitory period where you need government stability and you need faith in that governance, you empower hawks to be able to say that there is a weakness in this government and that we are not going to actually be able to move on. So you weaken Russia and its capacity to provide for people. But third of all, in the interim, as this continues, the US isn't trading because the Cold War hasn't ended. That means no money is funneling in. You have not achieved trade networks. You don't trust this country. So you're not negotiating and trading on an ongoing basis. Money isn't flowing between actors. You don't get to reestablish industries because those industries don't have powerhouses to be able to trade with in the first place. So that means proxy conflicts persist. The war does not end, and people are not making money, which they need to feed themselves and their family, instead of suffering in the aftermath of decades and decades of Cold War. I will take OG before I weigh this.
The harms of slow negotiations and sanctions accrue to you because you have to sanction nuclear countries in the status quo and into the future because you failed to initially disarm in the 90s.
It's just so different because the context matters quite a lot. Like there is an immediate harm to people because the Cold War has not ended and they need to reconstruct. That is different from the status quo where fine, sometimes you have to sanction, but by and large, you trust that nuclear arms aren't going to be used. But the threat to them is not one of the absence of trade in its entirety currently. Why does this matter so much? I think that you should care about our contribution because we prove certainty that no other team has. There are certain deaths, for example, that happen when you don't have trade and when you cannot rebuild an economy that was devastated by the Cold War compared to the 0 deaths that we can empirically point to caused by nuclear arms. Second, trade is the most important thing because trade starting between the West and Russia is what stopped conflict because when you trade with actors that you otherwise have conflicts with, it hurts you to go to war with them. It creates avenues for diplomacy beyond conflict. So you are in regional trading blocks, for example, or you exist in the WTO, for example. So there are other ways of being able to hold you accountable anyways. So the important thing is then we prove that nuclear arms are not a threat, but we do also show that in the absence of solid negotiations that did work quickly, what you have is impoverished people suffering in their day-to-day that they do not stop in the world of government. And for this reason, we oppose.
I'd like to thank the member of the opposition for those fine remarks and welcome up the government whip. Here.
I was initially going to go easy on Kate because it seemed like he was having a bad time. But that extension really does absolutely zero work for the CO team for several reasons. The first thing they suggest is that the NPT has worked. One, it did not. Countries like Iran, countries like North Korea got nukes after the NPT was established. Clearly has not worked. But also, even in 2023 itself, countries like China are building up nuclear supplies because they're gearing up for more of a conflict. Deeply unclear to me as to why this has any actual meaningful benefit in the world. The second thing to note here is I'm actually also unclear of the harm, because the claim here is that with NPT took a long time to get, therefore there is an opportunity cost from doing other useful things. But the problem with this argument is, number one, obviously the best way to do things like development is just to use other sources of money. Unclear why it comes from the same pool of money. But also, secondly, the best thing is just to end conflict, because conflict is what impoverishes individuals and prevents them from being able to do productive economic activity. It's why Russia went through a massive glut, because they funded all of their money into military and not enough money into, for example, feeding their people or inventing things or actually stimulating their economy. Ending the conflict is what allows these things to occur, and as a result is likely to get the most developed in the world. And the third thing to note here is also just unclear to me as to what the harm on the outside they levy against us is, essentially, right? Which is to say, they're like, well, when you try to get more things, people will not come to the table. But the problem is, people already came to the table for the NPT. I'm unclear as to why you can just ask for more during the negotiations there, because going to the NPT at least demonstrates a will and an intent to negotiate and to be able to come to a world where you can actually achieve peace and achieve a world where nuclear weapons do not represent the threat it did for the last 40 years. That is why I think CO's extension falls out in this debate and probably means there is not much left to stand there. But now let's start with why we win the debate, which is say we explain why denuclearization actually occurs, which is say OG has a swathe of mechanisms which are good, such as the incentives of fear, cost, etc. But the problem is all these incentives existed in the status quo, but it did not explain why you could not get any more than the NPT, and that is problematic. This is when Uday comes in and explains why we're actually able to get people to denuclearize completely as opposed to just reducing things like proliferation, which is say it is because the world lacks a structure which guarantees security for countries, which is why they live in fear and why they distrust other people and are likely to want to hold on to their nuclear weapons. We explained this with like strengthening mechanisms like international law, such as bringing forward aggression so it activates not in 2018 but activates in the 1990s and would have come in force with many conflicts like the Gulf War, like the Iraq War, or any of these things which existed in 2000s. It looks like strengthening the United Nations' ability to enforce sanctions that have more unanimity, such as countries do not fund weapons to other rogue states because they want to make a buck out of things. These are things we suggest are the ones to actually achieve change and actually achieve change. So what responses do we hear? The first response we hear from OO is essentially they go, well, why would you give up on self-defense? Well, the US still has the largest military in the world. I'm sure they're doing fine in the self-defense era. It's unclear how much the nukes add to that. CG's contestation is that, well, they now no longer come to the negotiating table. The first thing I explain is that they're already at the negotiating table, so therefore we probably achieved that step already with the NPT. But importantly, when you think about the actors want to talk about, people like Yeltsin and Russia were people who were, as I flagged in the POI, actually funded by the US and actually relatively close to the US. Countries like China was not the China of today. It was back then with Deng, it was back then like Zhang, who obviously were far more willing to cooperate with the US and cooperate with international order. That's why all these big nuclear powers were actually all able to come to the table in ways which are relatively productive. And it isn't convincing every single country in the world. It's convincing the few nuclear powers in the world, which becomes like 40 nations. As a result, means it is far more achievable. But the third thing I would observe is that our mechanism is distinct from opening because they rely on kind of the coercive mechanisms. On the outside, all we say is that we provide them a carrot, which is a security structure which protects these people, and it is within your own interest to opt into the security umbrella. And as a result, that is something which countries are far more likely to do, and that is why we achieve security on the outside as opposed to just the general things which we talk about which already had existed before. That is why I think the responses against our case fall, and then so let's deal with the impacts then, right? Which is to say, we explain very simply, the creation of a security structure not only reduces things like nuclear war, it also reduces things like non-nuclear war. And clearly, as all teams agree, nuclear war is not that common. It offers an existential risk, but in most of the things which happen are people invading each other, people having some sort of conflicts here or there. We create a structure where it says aggression is not allowed. If it occurs, we will prosecute you in the ICC, and we will enforce sanctions upon you. That is something which is impermissible, and also one which states can buy into as well, because they recognize that they are able to enforce against nations who are likely to harm them as well. This is the impact which outstrips every other impact in this way, and that is why CG clearly wins. But before then, CO.
When Barack Obama tried to achieve nuclear...
Sorry, what's your extension? Can you give me the mech again? I don't understand why you get more security.
Oh, so we explained the reason why people are not opting in right now is because people are scared about their own security and therefore want to hold on to nuclear weapons. We explained that the only way to actually achieve disarmament is if you offer them a carrot, which is say more security, which is to say, you know, like, well, having guarantees if things happen, to establish the Rome Statute to prosecute things like aggression, having more of these guarantees to prevent things like war is why countries are far more willing to operate. That is the mechanism. Oh, do you have one?
So your extension rather derivatively relies upon states acting rationally in response to the infrastructure you employ. But as I said in my speech, states act irrationally in the name of nationalism and distrust and pride all the time. States simply will not opt into the utopia that you want to create.
Okay, I'll do it you guys now because I was just whipping. So, 3 parts to this case. Firstly, Russia would never agree. A few responses. Number one, I think this is a mistake assuming post-war Russia operates exactly like Putin's Russia. As I flagged, Yeltsin, pretty close to the US. People in general wanted things like blue jeans and rock and was willing to buy into narratives of international cooperation because they didn't like things like conflict, which suggests that people are willing to see this as a new start, a blank slate, and willing to start cooperating in those instances as well. The second thing they say is that other countries won't disarm. Well, number one, our extension resolves when we give them the incentive to do so. Secondly, we explain why the rogue states and Shade talked about are far less able to be able to generate sorts of able to acquire things like nukes, but more countries opt into disarmament for the very reason you can't sell information, they do not have nukes, you can't access other markets if people are not selling weapons grade uranium or whatever. The third note is that even if this actually occurs, if you have unanimity in terms of people, many countries opting into disarmament, if one country tries to go rogue, the enforcement mechanisms against them are far more strong, which is to say, if North Korea wants to have nukes now, China now also sanctions North Korea as opposed to giving them a lifeline, and that is the benefit which we gain there. The last thing they say here is that, well, under your side, you do some military invasion or whatever, that is bad. I think this is an absurd claim because obviously this would entrench the need of nukes. That's why we're far more willing to use things like a carrot saying we'll offer you security, and that is far more likely to get the outcomes which we wanted to do as well. That's why isn't this way we're the only team just remotely imaginative about reimagining the way in which international law and global structures actually operate. We're the only team which is able to guarantee security and able to have people opt into this. The opposition team raise no harm and settle for essentially a policy which has not worked for the past 2 decades.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his fine remarks and welcome up the opposition whip to close out the debate. Here.
I'll take POIs visually. It'll be from OG at 4 or 5 minutes. You can raise your hand if you would like. I'm just saying that I won't respond otherwise. Sorry, I have a weird request. Udai, would you mind turning your camera off, or like whoever's in the briefing room, just because I can see myself on like the projector and it's like extremely strange. Thank you so much. The Cold War may have been cold, but that didn't make it any less deadly. In the Cold War, the world was riven in two. And what that meant was that there are power struggles in which one half of the world is trying to choke the other into submission through economic deprivation. There was mistrust, which means that communication about diseases, about research that could have enriched both sides of the conflict and really saved lives wasn't being spread. But also, you were struggling for territory and influence, which meant that people within Vietnam, people within various like Northern African countries were the innocent victims of proxy conflicts that neither great power was affected by. The Cold War was absolutely devastating for people across the world and really, really hurt people. And I think that trying to end that as soon as possible is a humanitarian issue and an impact that we very, very clearly prove. It's impossible for them to quickly end this because of what we told you earlier. What I'm going to do now is just respond to the CG claim about how the fact that we were able to have the NPT implies that people were willing to go into the table in the first place. This is not true. The NPT is way less difficult to opt into than this policy of total disarmament. One, because it doesn't require active effort right now. Like active disarmament involves taking your nukes, deconstructing them, or like finding some way to dispose of them, and doing this for tens of thousands of massively delicate and complicated weapons, which is a question of millions of dollars. Two, because you don't require checking as to whether or not you've made substantial progress right now. It's a commitment, a promise diplomatically, as opposed to needing to make progress right now. That would require a giving up of sovereignty, allowing like US inspectors into your borders, for example. But three, and most importantly, because it does not require you to make yourself vulnerable. Because even if you promise not to use nukes in the future or to decrease your reserves as much as possible, you still have them, which means that if any other actor decides to fuck you, you have ways to unfuck yourself as well. Whereas if you actually lose all your nuclear weapons, you do become absolutely powerless, and you are dependent on the absolute trust from every other actor in order to prevent an existential tail risk that is devastating. For those reasons, I think this is something that's much, much more difficult to opt into than the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It creates a sense of vulnerability that empowers hawks within Russia, within various other Eastern European countries that are already kind of dubious on the process of ending your Cold War and abandoning your ideology in order to integrate into a nuclear world order headed by the USA, that now put up a much larger fight. O attempts to prove with certainty that this means that there cannot be any of the success of this policy whatsoever. Maybe they succeed. I personally don't think so. But I think what we prove is that independent of whether or not the timeline is about whether or not you're able to succeed or not succeed, that the most likely outcome is that at some point the USSR folds anyway. The difference is that it takes many, many more decades of suffering for that to happen on our side. Why does that outweigh other teams in the debate? Just very simply because I think we have an extremely large harm, i.e. the USSR was really, really struggling. The fact that you were blocking yourself off from trade, the fact that you were dependent on a method of planned economy and had a lot of difficulty transitioning out of this without having shared resources from the US meant that people were literally going hungry. People had no access to medicine. People were just cold because they had not enough secure access to fuel, for example, which meant that like just thousands of people died who otherwise wouldn't need to. But second of all, because there is also just like enormous harm to the proxy warfare that otherwise would not have ended because you were still at each other's throats, which were just claiming tens of thousands of lives in developed countries for whom nuclear weapons are just like out of reach entirely, and they were just dependent on the US and Russia getting their shit together for these lives to be saved. So I think we access a massive scale of harm in terms of human life. But the difference is we prove this to a huge degree of certainty as well, which is like empirically, I think it's just true, which outweighs OG because they are like extremely dependent on a very, very small tail risk that I'm going to prove they don't access. But number two, because even for OO, if they prove that they opt out, their impacting is quite dependent on like future rearmament and other like pretty speculative, unclear harms, whereas we just tell you empirically speaking, like there is harm that otherwise would have occurred. Okay, before I go on, I'll take OG.
Your case seems to propose that this would extend the Cold War as a part of being a part of the détente under a unipolar US, which is the contention of both the motion and our setup.
Great. I don't know what that was supposed to achieve, gonna move on. So let's go into the CG extension, which I didn't understand until that POI, I'm so sorry. But the claim appears to be, sanctions wouldn't have worked, you would need to have a carrot, which is a security guarantee to prevent conventional war as well. Two simple responses. One, who would you need to give resources to in order to have them disarm their nukes? Russia, UK, France, massive developed countries that have large amounts of weapons otherwise, who are at no point at risk of being invaded and having conventional warfare affect them at all. Like, this is irrelevant because there are no conventional warfare happening between the US and any one of these developed countries. Conventional warfare happens when there's a huge asymmetry and when one country is absolutely powerless to affect the US because they have no long distance weaponry whatsoever, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. But number two, like, what does this even look like? They say the word security guarantee a bunch of times. Like, we have the Geneva Convention. Unfortunately, gas still kills many people. We still have torture. Countries will do whatever the fuck they want. So saying this, I don't think creates a substantial actual benefit. You don't actually able to constrain yourself in a way that meaningfully causes any safety. I think they say the claim, but they don't actually prove it. So what are nukes actually used for? I think they have massive passive value because the potential to create harm guarantees that no one fucks with you, but the prospect that they're used actively is basically zero. Because regardless of whether you use a nuke or a missile, whether 10,000 people die or 100,000 people die, launching a weapon of this scale at another country fucks you up because citizens, like many, many people die. The retaliation of any sort means that you yourself as a leader are at risk of death anyway. I don't think that active use of nukes or missiles are a question in this debate. The reason this matters is because the harms that OG proves and CG proves in terms of China, India, even North Korea and Iran having nuclear weapons doesn't matter because they're not going to be used in an active conflict in either side of the house, which means that like there is no significant harm. But it also means that the leverage claims coming from OG and on security on CG don't matter either because it's only happening to countries that are defenseless on either side of the house. OG says that you're able to decrease the risk of nuclear war. But I think that the fact that nuclear weapons are not pragmatically used on either side, and because infrastructure to prevent accidents has been getting better, as for Isaac, I think that even if they prove that there's a magnification of the chance because there's a lot of time that happens because there are a large number of nukes, if the probability they're used in the first place is like 0.001%, like even if this is taken to the power of like 5, for example, it's still a vanishingly small probability that will not be weighed in the round. Extremely happy to oppose.
All right, thanks everyone. I'll thank all the teams for a fine debate. Judges will go into a breakout room, and judges in the room will go find a room. Cool. All right, thanks.